The bullet grazed his left shoulder the same moment he felt the photograph crumple against his chest, and Killian Wade pressed his palm flat over his shirt pocket, as though protecting something more vital than his own heart. "She dead." The outlaw called from behind the boulder, his voice carrying that particular carelessness of a man who had never loved anything worth grieving. Killian did not answer. He could not answer, because the question had split him open in a way no bullet ever had. He pressed his back against the canyon wall, blood seeping warm through his fingers where he gripped his shoulder, and he reached into that shirt pocket with his other hand. The photograph was there, still there. Liora Mercer, 24 years old, standing in front of the millinery shop in Cassidy Falls with her chin lifted, and her dark eyes carrying that look she had. That look that said she had already decided something important, and nothing in the world was going to change her mind. He did not know if she was dead. That was the truth of it. That was the thing that made his hands shake worse than any wound. He had ridden away from Cassidy Falls 6 weeks ago with her photograph tucked against his heartbeat, and her voice in his ears telling him that she was not going to wait forever for a man who kept choosing duty over everything else. He had told her that a marshal's duty was not a choice. She had said that was exactly the problem. And then 3 days ago, a rider had come south with a message that Cassidy Falls had been taken by Dorian Voss and his outfit. 23 men who had burned the sheriff's office and were holding the town like a occupied territory, and that a woman matching Liora Mercer's description had been taken to ensure the town's cooperation. Killian had not stopped riding since. He thought about how it had all begun, though the present danger screamed at him to focus on the canyon, on the 2 rifles aimed somewhere above him, on the blood running down his arm. He thought about it anyway, because thinking about her was what kept him moving when nothing else could. He had arrived in Cassidy Falls in the spring of 1882, appointed by the federal district as Marshal of a town that had already buried 3 lawmen in 4 years. He had ridden in on a gray horse named Cannon, carrying a badge and a saddlebag full of warrants, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from a decade of wearing a star in places that did not want one. He was 31 years old, and he had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in so long he had forgotten what it felt like. The first thing he noticed about Cassidy Falls was that it needed paint. Every storefront was faded and peeling, and the main street had a lean to it like the whole town was slowly tilting toward the creek that ran along its eastern edge. The second thing he noticed was the woman standing outside the millinery shop with her arms crossed and her expression set hard as flint, arguing with a man twice her size about a delivery that had clearly gone wrong. Killian had pulled Cannon to a stop and watched without meaning to. The large man was gesturing broadly, using his size as an argument the way some men did, leaning forward and letting his shadow fall over her like a threat. Liora Mercer did not move back an inch. She looked up at him with those dark eyes and said something in a voice too low for Killian to catch, but whatever it was made the man's face go red and then go still. And then he picked up his crate and walked away without another word. She turned and noticed Killian watching and did not look away or look embarrassed. She looked at his badge and said, "Welcome to Cassidy Falls, Marshal. We've been through a few of you." "So I've heard," he said. "The last one lasted 11 days. I plan to last longer than that." She had tilted her head, that exact gesture that would come to occupy so much of his thinking, and said, "We'll see." Then she went back inside, and the bell above her door rang once, and Killian sat on his horse in the middle of the street for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, before riding on to find the ruins of the sheriff's office. He had learned about her in pieces, the way you learn about any place, slowly and in layers. Her name was Liora Mercer. She had come to Cassidy Falls 4 years ago from a town called Redwell, where her father had been a pharmacist and her mother had died of fever when Liora was 12. She ran the millinery shop with a competence that the rest of the town clearly relied on, and she had an opinion about everything and was not ashamed to express it. She was 24 and she was not married, which in a town the size of Cassidy Falls in the year 1882 was the subject of considerable discussion among people who had more interest in other people's lives than in their own. Killian had started going into the millinery shop on small pretexts. He needed a hatband replaced. He needed the brim of his hat reshaped. He needed, on one occasion, to ask if she had seen a particular stranger in town, though the description he gave was vague enough that he was not particularly surprised when she told him no. She had seen through the pretexts by the third visit and told him so directly, which he had respected more than he could say. "You could just come in and talk," she said. "You do not need a broken hat to justify conversation." "A marshal doesn't generally visit a shopkeeper without reason," he said. "Why not?" He had not had an answer for that. She made him coffee on the small stove she kept in the back room, and they had talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with law or hats. She asked him where he had come from before this posting, and he told her about the previous 4 towns, moving through them like a man counting off stations on a route he had not chosen. She listened carefully and said, "You have never stayed anywhere." "The job takes me where it takes me." "Is it the job?" she said and stopped. "What?" "Nothing." But her eyes said she had finished the sentence in her mind and filed the answer away. The danger in Cassidy Falls at that time was a man named Percy Galt, who ran a protection arrangement with the ranchers to the north and had an understanding with several members of the town council that kept the arrangement invisible to casual observation. Killian had spent his first 3 months in town quietly dismantling that arrangement, following the money from the cattle sales to the private bank accounts to the council members' new fences and horses, building a case that would hold in a territorial court. It was slow and unglamorous work, nothing like the gunfighter mythology that drifted around the marshal's profession. He had told Liora about it, not the specifics, but the nature of it, the patience required, the frustration of watching wrong things continue while evidence accumulated. She had listened and then said something that stayed with him. "You care about it being done right more than done fast," she said. "If it's done wrong, it unravels. Most people don't see that distinction." "You did," he said. Something changed in her expression, something that came and went quickly, but he had been paying close attention by then. The photograph had been taken by an itinerant daguerreotypist who came through Cassidy Falls in June of 1882, setting up his apparatus in front of the general store and charging 25 cents a sitting. Half the town had their picture taken. Liora had told Killian he should have his taken for the record, some official documentation of the town's new marshal. He had told her he was not interested in official documentation of his face. She had laughed, and he had thought that the sound of her laughing was the best thing Cassidy Falls had to offer. She had her photograph taken on a Tuesday afternoon, and he had watched from across the street, and afterward she had brought him one of the 2 copies she received and held it out and said, "So you have something to remember Cassidy Falls by if the job takes you on." He had taken it without speaking and stood looking at it for longer than the moment required. "That's a strange expression," she said. "I'm thinking that this is the first photograph anyone has ever given me." She looked startled, then sad, then composed again in rapid succession. "Well," she said, "now you have one." He had put it in his shirt pocket that afternoon, and it had not left his person since. He carried it on every ride into the hills to serve warrants. He carried it through the arrest of Percy Gault and 2 council members, which had involved more gunfire than he had hoped for. He carried it through a blistering August and into the cooler days of September, and every time he reached into that pocket for anything else and felt the photograph there, something steadied in him. The problem was exactly what Liora had identified in the early days of knowing him, that he had never stayed anywhere, and the badge on his chest was a promise to move when the territory required it, and Cassidy Falls was not a permanent posting. He knew this. He believed, in some part of himself that he could not fully examine, that it was unfair to ask her to attach herself to a man made of movement. He had not said this to her directly. He had instead continued to visit the shop, continued to accept her coffee, continued to have conversations that went deeper than any he had managed in years, and avoided with careful precision the subject of what they were to each other. She had gotten tired of that precision. The conversation that broke something between them happened in October, when the evenings were cold and the leaves along the creek had gone gold and brown. He had come by later than usual after a long day, and she was closing up the shop, and she had let him in, and they had sat in the back room with the lamp turned low and talked until the wood in the stove burned down to coals. "Killian," she said, and the way she said his name told him what was coming. "Liora. I need to know what this is." He was quiet. "Because I am not a woman who can spend another winter in ambiguity," she said. "I am practical in most things, and I have tried to be practical about you, but you are not a practical problem." "I'm not a problem," he said, and heard how weak it sounded. "You know what I mean." He did. He looked at the dying coals and said, "I don't know how long this posting holds. The territory can move me anywhere. I know that. It wouldn't be fair to you. That's not your decision to make for me," she said, very quietly and very firmly. "I am 24 years old, and I am fully capable of deciding what is or is not fair to myself. What I cannot decide is what you want, because you have not told me." He wanted to say it. He was so close to saying it. But something in him, some trained caution that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with years of leaving places and people behind, closed like a fist around the words. "I don't want you to build your life around a man who might be gone by spring," he said. She had looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I see," in the tone of a person who has received information they suspected but hoped to be wrong about. She had not been cold after that exactly, but something had drawn back in her. She was still courteous when he came into the shop. She was still herself, but the particular warmth that had been in her eyes when she looked at him had retreated behind something careful, and he could not blame her for it, because he had put it there. He had carried the photograph through the next 6 weeks and felt every mile of the distance he had made between them. And then Dorian Voss had ridden into Cassidy Falls. Back in the canyon, the rifles above him shifted, and Killian heard voices conferring in harsh whispers. He pressed his wound tighter and thought about the 6 days it had taken him to ride north, following the reports of smoke and violence that marked Voss's trail. He thought about the message that had described Liora being taken, and what the men who had sent the message had said about Voss's methods, about how he used people as leverage. He had ridden through 2 nights and a burning day without stopping. He looked at the photograph in his hand now just for a moment, her chin up and her eyes forward, and he put it back in his pocket and pressed against the canyon wall and planned. There were 2 men above him on the ridgeline. He had counted their shots. There was 1 man further up the canyon who had been moving parallel to him before the ambush broke, and that man had gone quiet, which was worse than hearing him. The canyon narrowed ahead, which was bad, and opened behind him, which was better, but going back meant losing hours he did not have. He moved forward. He had not been a reckless man since he was young and reckless in the way of young men who do not fully understand consequences. He had learned consequence by accumulation, by the long catalog of things that go wrong when patience runs out. And he applied this learning now, moving close to the canyon wall with his good arm and his revolver ready, and the blood from his shoulder dried enough that it was stiffening rather than flowing. The man who had been moving parallel to him was waiting at the canyon's narrowest point, and Killian had known he would be, and so he came around the corner, already low and already fast, and the two shots went past each other in the tight space, and only one of them connected. The man went down. Killian kept moving. The two on the ridgeline could not see the canyon floor at the narrow section, and by the time the canyon opened again, he was past their angle and moving toward the cluster of buildings that Voss had commandeered at the edge of Cassidy Falls. 4 structures around a central yard that had belonged to a tanning operation before the tanner had been given a persuasive argument to leave. He had studied the layout from a distance that morning before the ambush had caught him on his approach. He had noted the positions of the men posted at the corners, had counted windows and doors, had tried to understand from the patterns of movement where they were keeping the people they were holding. He also had help, though he had not expected it. Her name was Vera Carson, and she ran the post office in Cassidy Falls and had refused to leave when Voss took the town, citing what she called a federal obligation to the United States mail, that she was not going to surrender to any outlaw, regardless of how many men he had. Voss had apparently found this amusing enough not to shoot her, which said something about him that Killian filed away. She had managed to get a message out through a rider she trusted, and she had also, according to the message, been moving through the town carrying letters, observing, and reporting back to whoever among the townsfolk was still organized enough to receive it. Vera had left him a folded note under a particular stone at the edge of the main road, as she had described in her message. He had retrieved it at dawn before the ambush found him. The note told him that Liora Mercer was being held in the back room of the tanning operations main building, that she was not harmed but was being watched by at least 2 men at all times, and that Voss was using her specifically as an argument against the men of the town making any organized resistance, because everyone in Cassidy Falls knew who she was, and the thought of harm coming to her was effective. He thought about that. The thought of harm coming to her was effective. He understood that completely. He came into the tanning yard from the western side, where the old hide frames cast long shadows in the afternoon light, and the man posted at the western corner did not see him until it was too late to do anything useful. Killian moved through the shadow of the main building's outer wall and counted the windows. The back room had 1 window, high and small, which Vera's note had described. He could hear voices inside. 2 men talking about something ordinary with the particular bored tone of men assigned to guard duty, who do not expect anything interesting to happen. He needed a distraction from the front of the building, and Vera Carson had promised to provide one at 2:30 in the afternoon, which was, according to the position of the sun, approximately 4 minutes from now. He waited. Waiting was something he was good at. He pressed his back against the wall and breathed carefully and thought about October, about the back room of the millinery shop, about what he should have said when she gave him the chance. He should have said that he had put her photograph in his shirt pocket the day she gave it to him and had not taken it out since. He should have said that he had ridden through a lightning storm in August, and the first thought when the lightning was closest was not about his own survival, but about whether the photograph would survive, which had told him something important about himself. He should have said that the reason he was afraid of staying was not that he thought Cassidy Falls was the wrong place, but that he had learned, in the long catalog of leaving, how much it cost to be left, and he was terrified of being the one who did the leaving. He had not said any of it. He had said it would not be fair to her, which was the coward's version of the truth. At 2:30, the front of the building erupted in the sound of Vera Carson loudly, and with apparent sincerity insisting that she had a letter for one Dorian Voss that required his signature under federal postal regulations, and that she was not leaving until he received it, and that she was prepared to stand here until Christmas if necessary. Both men inside the back room moved toward the interior door, their voices lifting in confused irritation, and Killian was through the window before they made it to the hallway. She was sitting against the far wall with her wrists tied in front of her, and her dark eyes going wide at the sight of him coming through a small window in a way that was not graceful and was clearly costing him something in the shoulder department. And then her expression shifted through several things very quickly. "You're bleeding," she said. "I noticed," he said, and crossed the room and worked at the knots on her wrists, which were good knots done by someone who knew what they were doing. "Killian," she said very quietly. "Not yet," he said. "We need to be moving. I know, but I need to say something." "Liora, I am sorry about what I said, the part about not waiting. That was designed to hurt you, and it was not fair of me." He stopped working at the knots and looked at her face, which was composed in the way she went composed when she was feeling something very large. "It wasn't wrong," he said. "No, but it wasn't kind either." She held his gaze. "I was frightened. I said the thing I knew would sting. You were telling me the truth. Both things can be true." The knot came free. He took her hands in his and looked at her wrists, which were red but not badly damaged, and held them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for assessment. "We need to go," he said. "I know." He helped her up, and they went through the window the way he had come in, and she did not complain about the difficulty of it, or the fact that he could only fully use one arm, and she did not make any sound when the shoulder clearly gave him pain on the way down to the ground. She landed beside him and looked at his face and took his good arm, and they moved together through the shadow of the hide frames toward the western edge of the yard. Vera Carson's voice was still raised at the front of the building, and the quality of it suggested she had escalated to a discussion of federal law that had drawn an audience of several of Voss's men who were apparently uncertain how to handle a middle-aged postmistress, armed with an explanation of postal regulations, and absolutely no visible fear. They made it to the edge of the tanning yard and into the alley between the tannery and the cooper's shop, and Liora said, "Where are we going?" "My horse is tied on the north side of the mill." "We get to the horse, we get out of town, and then we get the territorial cavalry who are approximately 12 miles south and have been waiting for me to confirm that I have you clear before moving in." "You brought the cavalry. I sent word 3 days ago." "I may be single-minded, but I am not foolish. I never thought you were foolish." She was matching his pace, moving with him through the alley with her hand still on his arm. "I thought you were afraid." "I was afraid," he said. "Of what? Of this?" He glanced at her as they moved. "Of caring enough about a specific person in a specific place that the thought of something happening to her makes it impossible to think straight." She was quiet for a moment. "And how is that working out for you?" "Terribly," he said. "I have been riding for 6 days on almost no sleep, thinking about nothing else." "That sounds about right," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was heading in that direction. Cannon was where he had left him, tied behind the mill with a good view of the road and enough patience accumulated from years of being Killian's horse that he did not even register alarm at their arrival. Liora looked at the horse and then at Killian's shoulder and said, "Can you ride?" "I can always ride." "That is not an answer to my question." "Yes," he said, "I can ride." He helped her up first, which was a reversal of conventional arrangement, and then mounted behind her, and the shoulder made its objections known in a way that was difficult to conceal. And she put her hand over his on the reins and said, "I have you, Liora. Just ride." He rode. The Territory Cavalry arrived in Cassidy Falls at shortly after 4 in the afternoon, with enough organized authority to resolve the situation with Dorian Voss in the way that these things tended to resolve, which is to say with a great deal of noise, and a great deal of men on horseback, and a quantity of firearms that made argument unprofitable. Voss was arrested along with 17 of his men. 6 chose to run and were pursued and brought back the following morning. The town of Cassidy Falls emerged from the occupation with structural damage to 3 buildings, the loss of approximately $400 in goods from the general store, and a collective fury that was directed partly at Voss and partly at the broader systems that had made the occupation possible in the first place, a conversation that would continue for years. Killian learned all of this afterward, because in the immediate aftermath of reaching the cavalry position, he had gotten off his horse and sat down on the ground with a degree of inevitability that suggested he had been holding himself upright through force of will for some time. And the cavalry's medical officer had spent an instructive 40 minutes working on his shoulder. And during most of this process, Liora Mercer had sat beside him and held his good hand without saying much. When the medical officer was done and had delivered his opinion that the wound was clean and the bleeding controlled and the Marshal needed to rest for at least a week, Killian had looked at Liora and said, "You should not be sitting in the dirt." "I am choosing to sit in the dirt," she said. "I choose my own dirt. That is very true of you. I have been held in a tanning room for 3 days with nothing to do but think," she said. "I have thought a great deal. What did you think about?" She looked at him, and the afternoon light was catching the side of her face and the line of her jaw, and she said, "I thought about the fact that when they first brought me in there, the thing I was most frightened of was not what they might do to me, but that no one would know where I was. That the person I most wanted to know was you, and that you were somewhere south and probably did not know this had happened yet. And the idea of you not knowing was worse than the actual situation." He was quiet. "And then I thought," she said, "that a woman who spends her captivity most worried about whether a specific man knows where she is probably a woman who is in some difficulty regarding her feelings for that man, Liora. And then I thought," she said, "that I had told that man I would not wait forever, which was a true thing to say but was also perhaps a way of pushing him into deciding, and that the deciding should perhaps have been left to happen more naturally, except that I am not a particularly patient person when it comes to things that matter to me, which is a quality I have made peace with." "I am glad you are not patient," he said. "Are you? You said the thing I was too careful to say. You said there was something between us worth deciding about. I should have agreed. I was trying to protect you from uncertainty, and instead I made more of it." She looked at their joined hands. "You rode 6 days to find me. I would have ridden 60. I know that now." She turned to look at him directly. "I knew it then, I think. That was part of why I was so frustrated. I could see that you cared, and I could see you standing exactly at the edge of it and not stepping in, and I could not understand why. Because stepping in means something might go wrong," he said. "And what might go wrong was you. You're not making much sense. I mean that caring this much means there's a specific way things can be terrible now that didn't exist before. Before I knew you, losing things was a general hazard. Now it has a name." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "That is the most frightening and most honest thing I have ever heard someone say. I have been building up to it for several months. I noticed." He took the photograph from his shirt pocket, carefully, with his good hand, and held it between them. The paper was worn at the edges from handling, curved slightly to the shape of his chest where it had lived against him, and she looked at it and something moved through her expression. "You carried it," she said. "Every day, every ride, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones." He met her eyes. "Every time something reminded me that this work does not come with any guarantee of tomorrow, I put my hand on my chest and felt this in my pocket, and it was enough to keep moving." She reached out and touched the edge of the photograph without taking it from him. "Why didn't you tell me that?" "Because telling you that would have been the same as telling you everything else. It would have meant staying." And now, he put the photograph back in his shirt pocket and covered it with his hand. "Now I think staying is what I am going to do." She looked at him for a long time. The cavalry camp moved around them, horses and men and the sounds of an operation in progress. But where they were sitting on the ground with the late afternoon light going orange around the edges of things, it was very quiet. "Cassidy Falls," she said. "If they'll keep me on, I may need to request a permanent posting instead of the rotational assignment. I have grounds. The town is sufficiently complicated to require consistent law enforcement presence." That is a very official way to explain a personal decision. "I am a very official person." "No, you're not," she said. And now she was smiling, really smiling, and it was the best thing he had seen in 6 days of hard riding. "You are a man sitting in the dirt holding your shoulder and talking around the actual subject." "Liora Mercer," he said. "I would like to remain in Cassidy Falls permanently, and I would like, with your permission, to stop approaching this whatever it is as a man trying to protect us both from it, and start approaching it as a man who intends to be here." "To be here," she repeated. "In all the ways that means." She looked at him, steady and clear-eyed, and said, "That is the most commitment I have ever heard from you. I have more. Tell me." "I have been thinking of nothing but you for 6 days, and before that, I was thinking about you for 6 months and telling myself I wasn't. I have your photograph worn soft from handling. I rode into a canyon ambush this morning and my first instinct was to make sure the photograph was not damaged. I think that tells me something definitive about my state of feeling." "It tells you that you love me," she said very simply, the word between them in the late afternoon air. "Yes," he said, "it does tell me that." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his for a moment, careful of his shoulder, and he closed his eyes and breathed, and she said, very softly, "I have been in love with you since March, when you came into my shop with a hat that did not need fixing and stood in front of my counter not knowing what to say." "March," he said, "I have wasted a great deal of time. We both have." She sat back and looked at him. "We will not waste any more." "Agreed." She squeezed his hand once and then looked up at the cavalry camp and said in her practical voice, "You need to rest. Your shoulder is a serious injury and you have been ignoring it for hours, and the medical officer's instructions were specific." "I heard the medical officer." "You were not listening to the medical officer." "I was a little distracted," he said. "I had just gotten off a horse and sat down heavily on the ground in front of the woman I love and was experiencing several emotions simultaneously." "You can experience several emotions simultaneously while lying down," she said. "The medical officer's camp has a canvas roof and something that approximates a cot. Are you going to come be stern at me until I comply?" "Someone has to," she said, and stood up and reached out her hand, and he took it and let her help him up, and they walked into the cavalry camp together in the golden late afternoon light. And somewhere a horse made a soft sound, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass, and the last warmth of the day. He slept for 12 hours. When he woke, she was there, having arranged with the cavalry to remain in the camp rather than return to Cassidy Falls until the situation was more fully resolved. She had made herself useful in the way she always did, with calm efficiency and no apparent interest in being thanked for it. The cook had her on a first-name basis. Two of the cavalry officers had clearly been told about her, and were treating her with a particular respectful courtesy that he recognized as the cavalry's way of acknowledging that the Marshal had someone worth knowing. He sat up on the cot, and his shoulder was stiff and serious, and he moved carefully. She appeared in the door of the tent almost immediately, as though she had been waiting nearby, and she was carrying a tin cup of coffee, and she looked at him with something in her face that was simultaneously assessing and warm. "How do you feel?" she said. "Like I was shot and then rode a horse for some time and then sat in dirt," he said. "Accurate." She held out the coffee. "The medical officer wants to look at the wound this morning. He is concerned about the state of the sutures given how much you moved after he put them in." "I had reasons for moving." "He is aware of your reasons. He has nonetheless expressed professional frustration." She sat down on the edge of a camp chair and looked at him as he drank the coffee. "The cavalry commander sent a rider to Cassidy Falls last night. The town is secure. Voss and his men are in custody." He exhaled slowly. "Good." Vera Carson apparently argued with the arresting officer about the proper handling of the post office records. "That sounds right." He gave up and let her supervise the process. "Also sounds right." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "She risked a great deal to get you out." "She did." Liora's expression went serious. "I am going to think about what I can do for her in return for the rest of my life." She would tell you that she was following federal postal obligation. She would, and she would be both lying and telling the truth at the same time, which is something I have noticed is possible when people are trying not to be thanked for courage. She met his eyes. "Like someone else I know. I was following my duty as a marshal." "You rode 6 days without sleep." The ride was a marshalling activity. She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "You are a difficult man. You said that in March too. I have been consistently right about you." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands in her lap. "I would like to go home today if the medical officer agrees you can be moved. I want to see the shop. I want to make sure things are in order." "Of course." "I would also like, when things are in order and the immediate situations are resolved, to have a proper conversation." She looked up. "Not a canyon conversation or a cavalry camp conversation, a real one." "About what?" "About everything you said yesterday, about what comes next." She held his gaze. "You said you wanted to stay. I want to talk about what staying means." "We can talk about anything you want," he said. "Good." She stood up and smoothed her skirt, which was still dirty from 3 days in the tanning room, and said, "Then drink your coffee and let the medical officer look at your shoulder, and I will arrange for 2 horses." "Just 2? What about Cannon?" "Cannon is one of the 2, obviously." "He is your horse, and I would not assume otherwise." A small pause. "Though he is an exceptionally steady horse. I noticed that yesterday. He is the best horse I have owned. He stood perfectly still while you went in through that window. He has seen worse from me." She almost smiled again, and then went out of the tent to arrange things. Because Liora Mercer was a woman who arranged things. And he sat on the camp cot with his coffee and his aching shoulder, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the particular quality of the morning was something he wanted to be present for. They rode back to Cassidy Falls in the early afternoon. He and Liora, and a cavalry escort of 4 men who would remain in the town for a week to ensure stability. The road was dry and wide, and the hills to the east were brown and blue in the distance. And she rode beside him on a borrowed cavalry horse, and they did not talk much. But the silence between them had changed. Cassidy Falls looked worse coming in from the north. The tanning operation was still visible. though the military presence had organized it into something more official. Two of the buildings near the main street had fire damage on their upper stories, and the general store's front window had been replaced with boards. But the people were on the street, which they had apparently not been for days, and when Killian rode down the main street with the cavalry escort, several of them came out to stand on the boardwalk and watch. Vera Carson came out of the post office and stood in front of it and said nothing, but she looked at Liora, and Liora looked back at her, and there was something between those two looks that contained more than words would have managed. He established the prisoners' transfer arrangements with the cavalry commander and spent an hour with the remaining town council members, the ones who had not been involved with the previous corruption arrangement, going through what had happened and what would happen next. Cassidy Falls would need to formalize its law enforcement structures, which had been informal to a fault. He wrote requests for additional resources and sent them south with the cavalry's messenger. In the late afternoon, he walked to the millinery shop. The door was unlocked and the bell rang when he pushed it open, and Liora was behind the counter sorting through the stock, checking what had been taken or disturbed during the occupation. She looked up when he came in and then back at what she was doing. "How bad is it?" he said. "Not terrible." They took several things from the display case in the front, but most of the stock is undisturbed. She set down the box she was holding. "They used the back room as a sleeping area for 2 men, which I find unpleasant, but the furniture survived. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I am the Marshal. The security of this town is my responsibility. You came and fixed it," she said, "which is also your responsibility, and you fulfilled it. Do not take on the guilt of what happened while you were doing necessary work elsewhere." She looked at him with clear eyes. "You are not the reason Dorian Voss exists." He came to the counter and leaned against it, carefully on account of the shoulder. "You are very reasonable. I try to be." She came around the counter and looked at his shoulder. "The medical officer dressed it again before we left." "He did." "Does it hurt?" "Less than yesterday." "That is not the same as no." She reached up and touched the edge of the bandage through his shirt, a light, assessing touch that was not quite a medical evaluation but was not precisely not one either. "You should not be leaning against things." I needed to lean. "Toward me specifically or toward the counter?" He looked at her. "Is there a difference?" She looked back at him, and then she did something he had not seen her do before, which was reach up and put her hand flat against his chest, directly over the shirt pocket where the photograph lived, and press lightly. "It's still there," he said. "I know." She did not move her hand. "I wanted to feel it." He put his hand over hers. "Liora, you carried it through every dangerous thing," she said. "Every time you rode out of this town knowing you might not come back, every time something could have gone wrong, you carried it." "It helped," he said. "It helped me come back." "I want to help you come back," she said. "Every time." "Then let me ask you something." She looked up at him. "Will you allow me to court you properly?" He watched her face. "I am aware that we have been something undefined for several months and that I handled that badly. I would like to start over, or not start over exactly, but do the formal part of what should perhaps have been formal earlier. I would like to call on you. I would like to be present in a way that is honest about what it means. You want to court me. I want to court you. And eventually, when you are satisfied that I mean what I say about staying, I want to ask you more than that." Her eyes went still and clear. "More than that?" "Yes. Killian Wade," she said. "Are you suggesting that you have intentions?" "I am not suggesting it," he said. "I am stating it directly, because I have spent several months being indirect, and it has served neither of us." She looked at him for a long moment with that expression he had come to understand as her processing something she already knew the answer to, but wanted to consider fully before saying it. "Yes," she said, "you may court me properly." A pause. "Beginning now, if you like. Beginning now," he agreed. She moved her hand from his chest, but did not step back, and they were standing very close in the quiet shop with the afternoon light coming through the front window. And he thought that the light in the millinery shop was always the right color, and that this thought was not something he would have had at any earlier point in his life. "You should sit down," she said. "Your color is not good. My color is fine." You went slightly pale when you leaned against the counter. That was unrelated to the shoulder. She raised an eyebrow. "It was related to what I was about to say," he said. "Formal declarations are not something I have extensive practice in." "That was a very endearing thing to admit," she said, and went to put the kettle on. The weeks that followed were a kind of careful building, the way you build something after a storm has cleared the ground. Killian remained in Cassidy Falls on the permanent posting he had requested, which the territorial office granted with some relief, as finding marshals willing to take Cassidy Falls had always been difficult. He rebuilt the sheriff's office from the fire damage with help from 3 men in town who had their own reasons for wanting the law to be present and stable. And by the end of November, it was a better building than it had been before. He called on Liora every evening that was not occupied by the immediate demands of law enforcement, which were considerable but not constant. He had coffee in the back room of the millinery shop, and they had the real conversations she had asked for, which ranged across subjects in the way of conversations between people who are interested in each other's minds as well as their company. She told him about Redwell and her father, who had been a gentle and educated man in poor health by the time she left, who had written to her every month until he died 2 years ago. She told him about the decision to come to Cassidy Falls, which had been partly practical and partly what she described as the need to be somewhere no one had a previous version of her to compare to the current one. He told her about his family in the older sense. 2 parents and a younger brother in a town in Missouri that he had left at 17 and visited perhaps 4 times since. He told her about the brother, whose name was Samuel, and who had married young and had a farm and seemed genuinely content in a way that Killian had always found slightly foreign. He told her that he had never felt that the life available to him in Missouri was the one that fit him, which was not a criticism of Missouri or of Samuel, but simply a fact. "But you have worn yourself out being the one who moves," she said one evening. November was deep now and cold, and the stove in the back room was working hard. "I didn't think of it that way. You moved through 4 towns in 10 years, she said. "That's not a man following his calling. That's a man who has not been called anywhere specific yet." He looked at her. "Are you suggesting Cassidy Falls is specific?" "I am suggesting," she said carefully, "that maybe the specific thing was not the town." He put his cup down and looked at her across the small table. "I have been thinking," she said, looking at her own hands, "about the fact that you carried the photograph. You carried it from the day I gave it to you. You said it helped you come back." "Yes." "That is an extraordinary thing," she said. "Not the carrying exactly, but what it means about the state of your feelings before you said a word of it to me. I knew what I felt well before I could bring myself to say it." "How long, March?" he said. "The same day you identified." She looked up. "March, when you came in with the hat." "When I came in with the hat, and you saw through it immediately and told me I could just come in and talk. And I stood there not knowing what to say because what I wanted to say was not available to me at the time." He held her gaze. "I put the photograph in my pocket 3 months later, but I had been carrying you before that in all the ways that do not have physical form." She was very still. "I am sorry it took me so long to say it," he said. "I am sorry about October. You deserved a direct answer, and I gave you a practical concern that was real but was also a way of hiding. "You were frightened," she said. "I said that. It was more than that." He paused, choosing the words with care. "I had watched people I cared about leave or be left enough times that I had built the habit of not letting it get close enough to matter that much. And then it got close enough to matter. And I didn't know what to do with that, because the habit did not have instructions for this situation." "This situation being me," she said, in a voice that was not quite steady. "Being you," he confirmed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat in the warm room with the cold outside pressing against the windows, and he thought that this was what it meant to be in a specific place. Not the walls or the stove or the town itself, but this. In December, he introduced her formally to his brother Samuel by letter, which was both a gesture of seriousness and an acknowledgement that the world beyond Cassidy Falls existed and had to be informed. Samuel's response came back in late December, and was warm and curious, and contained, near the end, the observation that their mother would have liked to know about all of this in person, which Killian recognized as Samuel's tactful way of noting that Killian had been keeping his family at a significant distance for years. He wrote back a longer letter than he had written to his family in some time, and included the fact that he was permanently posted in Cassidy Falls now, and mentioned Liora's name with what he hoped was an appropriate level of information, and what he suspected was not nearly enough. Christmas in Cassidy Falls in 1882 was a community effort of the kind that happens after communities have been through something difficult together. The church organized a gathering. Several of the families on the ranches to the north came in, and there was music from a fiddle player named Archie, who could also play passably on a harmonica, and did both simultaneously by some mechanism that was not entirely clear. The general store had managed to restock most of what had been taken, and there was an atmosphere of deliberate good cheer that had real feeling underneath it. Liora wore a dark red dress that he had never seen before, and her hair was arranged differently than usual, and she came into the church gathering with Vera Carson, and they found him standing near the door, and Vera looked at his expression when Liora came through the door and had the grace not to comment on it. He danced with Liora, which was not something he was expert in but which he managed well enough that she did not wince. She told him he was not as terrible as he had claimed to be. He told her he had claimed nothing. She had assumed. She told him that was a distinction without a difference. He told her that was not strictly accurate. She laughed, and it was the same sound as it had always been, the best sound the town had to offer, and he thought about March and about all the time between March and now, and decided that some roads were long for reasons that made sense when you arrived. After Christmas, he found a different kind of rhythm, a life with regular structure in a place he intended to stay in, which was genuinely new. He kept his office hours and rode his circuit and handled the ordinary business of law in a small town with the patience that the work required. He had coffee with Liora every evening. On Sundays, he walked with her along the creek, where the cottonwoods were bare now in the winter cold, and they talked about things that were both small and important in the way of people who are making a shared world. In January, she asked him about the towns before Cassidy Falls, wanting specific details rather than the general accounting he had given before, and he told her properly about each one. The first posting had been in a town called Malvern when he was 22, newly badged and thoroughly certain of himself in the way of young men, and it had lasted 2 years and taught him most of the things he needed to know about the gap between certainty and reality. The second had been rougher, a cattle town where the law was a suggestion rather than a structure, and he had spent 3 years there and come out of it with a better understanding of when force was and was not the right instrument. The third had been a mining settlement with a corruption problem so deep that resolving it had taken 4 years and 2 trips to the territorial court, and the testimony of 17 men who were frightened and came forward anyway, which he told her was the most important part of that story. The testimony of frightened men, she said. The fact that they came forward despite being frightened. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's continuing in the presence of it. She had been quiet and then said, "That is what you were doing in October, continuing in the presence of it." "Badly," he said. "Not in the end," she said. "In the end you said everything. In the end I was sitting in dirt having been shot and you had been held captive for 3 days and the context was somewhat extreme. Sometimes people need extreme context," she said. "I needed some too." "What do you mean?" "I was frightened for 3 days in that room," she said. Frightened of several things, but the central one was the possibility that I had wasted the time I had by being too proud to tell you what I felt, by making the ultimatum about forever, instead of saying directly that I loved you and hoping that was enough. She looked at him. "I decided, sitting in that room, that if I got out, I was going to stop protecting myself from the possibility of being wrong. Because protecting yourself from being wrong also protects you from being right." He took her hand, which they had gotten comfortable with by now, and said, "You are the most forthright person I have ever known. It does not always feel that way from the inside. From the outside it is clear." She squeezed his hand. "You are also more forthright than you know. You just express it in actions rather than words. I carried a photograph. You rode 6 days and went through a canyon ambush and came in through a window to get me out of a tanning room," she said. "That is quite a lot of forthrightness. I would do it again. I know." She met his eyes. "That's the point." In February, he went to the territorial court at Dunmore to testify in the Dorian Voss proceedings, which required 5 days away from Cassidy Falls. It was the longest he had been away since his return, and the distance felt different now from how distance had always felt before, with a clear direction to it, a specific place he was going back to. He wrote to her from Dunmore, 2 letters in 5 days, which was more letter writing than he had done for personal reasons in years. He told her about the courthouse, which was newer than he expected and had a tendency to echo, and about the testimony, which was methodical and dry in the way of legal proceedings. He told her that Voss would be convicted. He was certain of it, and that the sentences would be long and that Cassidy Falls would not see those men again. She wrote back once, a single letter that arrived on his 4th day in Dunmore, and it was long and carefully worded and told him in fine detail about what was happening at the shop and in the town. And at the end of it, she said that Cannon had looked west twice this morning, which was the direction of Dunmore, and she chose to interpret this as the horse expressing their shared impatience for his return. He had read that part 3 times on the courthouse steps in the February cold, and then put the letter in his shirt pocket next to the photograph. He returned on a Thursday evening, riding in from the west with the sun almost down and the sky behind him orange and purple, and she was in front of the millinery shop when he came down the street, not waiting there in any pointed way but simply present, as though she had happened to be outside when he arrived, which he did not believe for a moment. He dismounted and she came across the boardwalk and he held out the letter she had written and said, "You said Cannon was expressing our impatience. I said I chose to interpret it that way. You said shared impatience." She looked at him. "I was impatient. So was I." He was still holding the letter and she was standing very close and he said, "I have been thinking these 5 days. What have you been thinking about?" "The same thing I have been thinking about since March," he said. Clarifying specifically and with more precision than I had in October or November or December or January. Her eyes were steady on his. He took a breath. "I have no talent for speeches, and you have never wanted one from me anyway, so I am going to say this simply. I love you and I intend to stay in Cassidy Falls and I want to marry you and I am asking if you will consider it." The street was quiet around them. Cannon made a small sound behind him. The sky was going darker at the edges. "Consider it," she repeated, "or decide immediately. Either approach works for me." She looked at him for a moment that was longer than the ordinary moment, and he let it be long because she was thinking and she was entitled to think, and he had learned that her thinking was worth waiting for. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes," he exhaled. "You look relieved," she said, and now there was that almost smile. "I am profoundly relieved. Did you think I would say no?" "I thought there was a possibility," he said. "I was prepared for it." "Were you?" "No," he said honestly. "I was not prepared for it at all." She laughed, and he reached out and put his hand along her jaw and kissed her there in the street in the purple evening light, which was the first time, and which was better than anything he had imagined. And he had imagined it with some frequency since March. They married in April of 1883, in the church in Cassidy Falls, on a day that was warm enough to have the doors open and let in the smell of the new grass along the creek. Vera Carson served as a witness. Samuel came from Missouri, which surprised Killian considerably and moved him more than he was prepared for, and Samuel was a broad, warm man who shook Killian's hand and then looked at Liora and said, "I see why he stayed." Liora said, "I see why he left Missouri. You are an entirely different person." Samuel had laughed and decided immediately that he liked her. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend who had been in Cassidy Falls for 6 years and had married a sufficient number of people to have developed real facility with the proceedings. Killian stood at the front of the church and watched Liora come down the short aisle in a dress the color of cream that she had made herself, and she walked with her chin up in the exact way she had in the photograph, and he put his hand on his chest for a moment where the photograph lived in his shirt pocket, and she saw him do it, and something in her expression went soft and direct at the same time. She had asked him once in the weeks before the wedding whether he would keep carrying the photograph now that she would be present. He had said, "I'll carry both." "Both," she said. "The photograph is worn soft from 6 months of carrying. It is a record of something. I don't want to stop carrying it." She had looked at him with an expression he could not fully catalog, all the feelings present at once, and said, "You are more sentimental than you let on. Don't tell anyone. I won't have to. You just told me." He had carried the photograph through the 6 months of building and courting and deciding, and he carried it to the wedding, and he would carry it after. They stood in front of the Reverend and said the words that were required, which were simple and serious and meant what they said. He put a ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Dunmore, a simple gold band, and she had said when she saw it that it was exactly right, which was the response he had been hoping for. Outside the church afterward in the April sunshine, Samuel pulled him aside for 30 seconds and said, "You look different. I'm the same person." "No, you're not." Samuel had that smile he'd had since they were boys, the one that knew things. "You were always somewhere else before." Even in the same room. Killian looked across the churchyard to where Liora was talking with Vera Carson, her face animated and her hands moving in the way they moved when she was fully engaged. "Not anymore," he said. "No," Samuel agreed. "Not anymore." Samuel stayed 4 days, and then rode back to Missouri carrying a standing invitation to return, which Liora had issued with characteristic directness. He left looking pleased about his brother in a way that Killian found, to his own surprise, genuinely gratifying. The months that followed were the months of a life being built. They moved Liora's things into the house that Killian had been renting on the north end of town, a small place with a good stove and a porch that faced west, and spent 2 Saturdays making it into a shared space, which involved some negotiation about shelving and furniture placement, and was conducted with a remarkable lack of friction, because they were both practical people who understood compromise as a necessary skill. She kept the shop. He kept his posting. The rhythms of the town wrapped around them, and they became part of those rhythms, which is what it means to be somewhere specific. People in Cassidy Falls knew them as a unit now, the Marshal and the milliner, and there was something in that recognition that he had not expected to value as much as he did. He still rode out regularly to serve warrants and patrol the broader territory that was his responsibility, and she still worried when he was gone, which she told him honestly rather than pretending she did not. He told her he would always come back. She told him that was a promise with limits he could not fully control. He agreed and said he would make his best effort on the matter of coming back, which was the honest version of the promise, and she had accepted it. He still carried the photograph. He reached for it less often now, or perhaps differently. Not as a talisman against uncertainty, but as something he was accustomed to having, the way you are accustomed to something that has been part of your daily reality long enough that its absence would register as loss. He carried it through the summer rides, and through a difficult autumn in which a cattle dispute in the northern range became serious enough to require 3 weeks of negotiation and careful intervention. He carried it through a long November when he was sick with a fever that put him in bed for 8 days, and she sat with him through the worst of it with a patience that undid him. "You don't have to stay," he said on the 4th day when he was past the worst of it and had enough sense to be embarrassed by how poorly he had been. "I'm your wife," she said. "That doesn't mean you have to sit here." "I know it doesn't mean I have to. I want to." She was refolding the cloth she had been using to cool his forehead. "Killian, I spent 3 days in a tanning room being frightened about whether I had enough time with you. I am not going to waste the time I have by sitting in the other room when you are sick." He looked at her. "You are a remarkable person. I am a practical person who knows what matters to her." She pressed the cloth to his forehead. "Go to sleep." "I don't want to sleep. I've been sleeping. You need more sleep." "I want to talk." "You can talk and then sleep. That seems like a compromise." "Most good things are," she said. He told her, in the drowsy way of a man whose fever was breaking, about a day from his childhood that he had not thought about in years. A summer afternoon when he was perhaps 9 years old, and his father had taken him fishing on a creek, and they had not caught anything but had sat on the bank for most of the afternoon in a silence that was comfortable and complete. He had thought about that afternoon sometimes over the years as an example of a certain kind of ease, the ease of not needing to perform or explain, just being somewhere with someone. "That is what this is," he said. "What we have." She looked at him, her hand on the cloth. "Yes," she said. "That is what it is." He fell asleep, and when he woke she was still there, reading a book by the low lamp, and the sight of her there reading in the lamplight was so ordinary and so right that it stayed with him after he was well as a memory of the specific texture of what he had built and chosen. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child, and she told him in the shop in the late afternoon with the same directness she brought to everything important. He was behind the counter she had put in for him to lean on when he visited, and she came from the back room and said, "I have something to tell you," and told him. He stood very still for a moment, and then came around the counter and held her, carefully, as though she were something he wanted to take particular care of, and she said into his shoulder, "You do not need to hold me like I'm glass. I'm healthy and the same person I was yesterday." "I'm aware of that," he said. "I am holding you like this because I want to." "That's different," she said. All right. He held her and thought about the photograph in his pocket, and about March of 1882, when he had come into the shop with a hat that did not need fixing and had no idea what was beginning. Their son was born in October of 1884, and they named him James, after nobody in particular, just because it was a name that suited him from the first moment of meeting him, which was a thing you could tell right away. He arrived into a world that was, by the standards of Cassidy Falls and the broader territory, considerably more ordered than it had been 2 years earlier, which Killian felt a quiet satisfaction about without claiming too much credit for. James was a sturdy child with his mother's eyes and his father's tendency toward silence as a default mode of processing, which Liora found both familiar and amusing. He watched everything carefully from an early age, and Liora said that he was collecting information before he committed to any response, which was exactly his father's method. "I don't do that," Killian said. "You do that constantly," she said. "You watch and then you act with absolute precision. James does the same thing with his breakfast." Killian had looked at his son, who was at that moment sitting very still looking at a spoon with deep concentration. "He is 9 months old." "Start early," Liora said. He had laughed, and it was the sound of a man who had become practiced at laughing, which was something that had not come naturally to him before and did now. Vera Carson was a devoted presence in their lives and in James's, coming by regularly with gifts and opinions, and the particular energy of a woman who had committed fully to her chosen family and was reliable as the male she served. She and Liora had deepened into a friendship that was, by any measure, one of the most important relationships in both their lives, and Killian was glad of it, because he understood that the fullness of a life required more than any one relationship could provide. In 1885, the territorial circuit reassigned 2 other marshals to Cassidy Falls's broader district, which meant Killian's individual patrol burden decreased and he was home more consistently. He used the additional time to finish the shelving project in the back room that had been planned since they moved in, and to build a proper storage structure behind the house for hay and equipment, and to teach James, who was walking now and determined about it, to approach the horse with appropriate caution while still not being afraid of him. Cannon had the patience of an old and wise animal, which he was becoming, and submitted to James's exploratory attentions with what appeared to be quiet dignity. He also used some of the time to write more regularly to Samuel, and in the summer of 1885, Samuel and his wife Liora came west to visit. Liora was a composed and perceptive woman who looked at everything carefully, and she and Liora went off together the first afternoon and talked for 3 hours without including anyone else, which both men observed from a distance and accepted as a positive sign. Samuel said, standing on the porch watching this, "She's the best thing that ever happened to you." "I know," Killian said. "You look like a person now." "I was always a person. You know what I mean." He did know. He had always been a person in the literal sense, functional and present and capable. But the specific quality that Samuel was identifying was something else, the quality of a person who is at home in their own life, who has stopped moving not because they stopped, but because they have arrived. "Yes," he said, "I know what you mean." Samuel and Liora stayed 10 days and left carrying an invitation to return at Christmas, which they accepted. Liora had issued the invitation with the tone of someone informing rather than asking, which Samuel told Killian privately was exactly how his mother had operated, which he meant as the highest possible compliment. James was walking steadily by Christmas, and had begun to develop opinions about his immediate world, most of which he expressed through gesture and sound, with the occasional word emerging like a surprise. His first word of genuine use was more, which Liora said was appropriate for a person who was going to want a great deal out of life. In the early months of 1886, Liora told him they were expecting again, and he responded with considerably more fluency than the first time, holding her and saying the things he meant, and not holding himself back from saying them, which was what 3 years of practice with the honest expression of feeling had done for him. Their second child, a girl they named Clara, arrived in September of 1886 during a warm spell that made the evenings golden and long. She arrived with a quantity of dark hair and an immediate impression of knowing her own mind, which Killian told Liora was familiar. "She looks like you," he said, which was not entirely true in physical terms but was true in the sense he meant it. "She looks like herself," Liora said, which was also true and perhaps more precisely true. James was 2 years old and approached the arrival of a sister with the careful, watchful attention he brought to new phenomena, and within a week had decided she was acceptable and demonstrated this by bringing her a spoon, which was his highest gift. The life they had built continued to layer and deepen in the way that lives do, when the people in them are paying attention and choosing to be present. Killian rode his circuit and kept his office and handled the business of law in a territory that was slowly, imperfectly, and in ways that acknowledged the injustices that had made it necessary, becoming something more organized and accountable. He was not naive about the complexity of that process, or about the ways in which formal law had served some people better than others across the years. And he thought about those questions, and tried to act in ways that reflected his thinking, which was the most that could be said for any person in the middle of the imperfect work of any era. He carried the photograph through all of it. It was old now, the paper worn thin and soft, the image holding but faded, Liora's face in that dignified pose in front of the shop looking out at the years between then and now. He had told her once, when James was a baby and they were sitting on the porch in the evening, that he thought the photograph would eventually become too fragile to carry. "What will you do then?" she asked. "Carry something else that matters. What would you carry?" He looked at her holding their son in the warm evening air. "I'm not sure I'll need to carry anything as a substitute," he said. "I think by then I'll have learned to carry what matters in a way that doesn't require an object." She had looked at him and said softly, "You have already learned that. You've been learning it for 4 years. I'm a slow learner. You are not a slow learner, you are a careful one." "Is there a difference?" "Considerable," she said. "Slow learners resist the lesson, careful ones examine it from all sides before they accept it." She settled James more comfortably against her. "You examined it very thoroughly." "I had some good instruction," he said. "You had some very impatient instruction," she said, "and then the instruction had to take a different approach. The 3 days in the tanning room approach." "Exactly." "Very effective. I would have preferred a less dramatic process." "So would I," she said, "but here we are, here they were." He looked at the porch and the yard and the street beyond, and the town that was lit by the evening and inhabited by people who were carrying their own weight of history and hope and ordinary daily need. And he thought about the road from the canyon where he had been pinned down with a bullet in his shoulder and her name in his mind and her photograph pressed against his chest, to this porch with the warm evening around them and her voice beside him. The photograph stayed in his pocket. He put his hand on his chest now, on the porch, feeling the shape of it there. The years stretched ahead of them in the way that years do when you are building something real, full of ordinary things and important things, and the layered accumulation of days that individually are unremarkable and collectively are everything. More mornings with coffee in the back room of the shop. More evenings on the porch watching the light change over the hills. More rides he returned from, and each returned the same reliable fact, the door opening in her face and whatever she was in the middle of when he came home, which was always something, because she was never not engaged with what was in front of her. James at 4, then 5, then 6, learning the names of the hills and the creek and the horses, learning to read from his mother with the patient seriousness he brought to everything, learning from his father the difference between watching and understanding, which was the most important lesson Killian knew how to give. Clara at 2, then 3, then 4, with her mother's directness and a laugh that arrived without warning and filled the whole room, and a particular friendship she developed with Vera Carson that was the delight of both of them. Vera Carson at her post office, reliable as ever, growing into the role of someone the town could not imagine having been without, which was how the best people come to fit their places. Samuel and Linger visiting every other year or so. The relationship between the brothers deepening with distance and time into something richer than proximity had allowed when they were young men in the same town, with the same expectations placed on them. The town itself, growing and changing in the ways of the territory, some of the changes good and some complicated, and all of it requiring the kind of attention and care and honest reckoning that Killian tried to bring to his work, and Liora brought to everything. On a September evening in 1889, sitting on the porch 7 years from the photograph and 6 years from the wedding and 5 years from James and 3 years from Clara, Liora said, "I was thinking about the day I gave you the photograph." He was quiet, listening. "I was thinking about what I intended when I gave it to you," she said. "I've told myself different things over the years about what I intended. What do you think now? I think I knew exactly what I was doing." She looked out at the evening street. "I gave you something to carry because I wanted you to carry me. I just didn't know how to say it yet. You gave it to me in June," he said, 4 months before you asked me to say what we were. I was working up to it, Liora. I was hopeful in June and frustrated by October. That's a fair characterization of 4 months with me." She turned to look at him, and the light was the way he had memorized it. The particular gold of Cassidy falls in the evening. "It was not only frustrating," she said. "No, most of it was not frustrating at all." She reached over and put her hand over his, which was resting on the arm of the chair, and they were warm and easy with each other in the way of long years together. "Most of it was exactly what I wanted, even before you said so." "March," he said. "March," she agreed. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the photograph. It was very worn now, the edges soft and slightly frayed. The image faded to something that required knowing what it depicted to fully see it. He held it in the evening light. "I can still see it," she said. "So can I." He looked at it for a moment. "I always will." She took it from him gently and held it herself, looking at herself, 7 years younger, standing in front of the shop with her chin up. And then she handed it back, and he put it back in his pocket. And they sat on the porch together in the September evening while the town went quietly about its business, and the children's voices came occasionally from inside the house, and the hills to the east went dark by degrees, and the first stars came out over Cassidy Falls. There was nothing left open between them. No distance uncrossed, no words unspoken, no understanding incomplete. The man who had ridden in one spring morning on a gray horse with a badge and a saddlebag, and no particular reason to stay, had built something out of that stopping. Had built a life that fit him in every dimension that mattered, that had room for his particular nature and made room for hers, that had been made by the accumulated choosing of 2 people who saw each other clearly and kept choosing. He put his hand on his chest one more time, feeling the familiar shape of the worn photograph against his heartbeat, and Liora was beside him, and the evening was warm, and the stars were coming out one by one over the town where they had built everything worth having. He was home. He had been home for years, and every dangerous ride behind him had been worth every mile because every mile had led him back to this, back to her, back to the porch, and the light and the sound of his children inside and his wife beside him, and the whole steady beating fact of a life fully lived. The photograph stayed in his pocket. It would always stay in his pocket, because carrying it was not just about her, though it was about her, and not just about what it had meant in the hard and uncertain days, though it had meant everything in those days. It was about what it meant now, too, about the continuity between the man who had ridden into a canyon with her face against his heartbeat, and the man sitting on this porch with her hand in his. The thread between those two moments that was his whole life and hers, and what they had made together. That thread was real, it was strong, and it held.